Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Astrid Rasch, and I'm an associate professor of English at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Thank you very much for coming on this afternoon. It's my great pleasure to be able to bid you all welcome to this conversation between Bettina Gapper and Elike Böhmer on literature and the politics of the past in Southern Africa. This is the second event in a series of workshops and public events under the headline of Literatures of Change, Culture and Politics in Southern Africa. Through these events, we aim to set up a network in the Nordic countries and beyond of scholars working on African culture. We believe that a cultural perspective like that provided by literature, but also by history, archaeology, musicology, theatre and film studies is crucial for understanding any society, including its politics. And we've been fortunate enough to convince the Nordic Research Councils that they should fund the establishment of such a network. So we hope that this event will be just one of a long string of gatherings in the years to come. In fact, the results of our first events are soon to be published as a special issue of the Journal of Southern African Studies on the theme of writing repression in Zimbabwe, which is volume 47, issue 5, and it's going to be out soon in a online store near you. So today we will hear from two acclaimed writers, Zimbabwean novelist and short story writer Bettina Gapper and South African writer and critic Elike Böhmer. They will address the theme of literature and the politics of the past. So the Southern African past is replete with moments of pain and trauma, but also moments of resistance, survival and celebration. Which of these moments is commemorated and how are political questions. Questions about who has the power to define the nation or the community, who has the platform to speak and on whose behalf. Politicians and institutions have many means at their disposal to promote a certain story about the past. But citizens have their ways of challenging established accounts. In 2015, in a powerful precursor to last year's toppling of statues, a student threw a bucket of shit on the statue of Cecil Rhodes on Cape Town University's campus. This unambiguous gesture of disgust launched a string of protests in South Africa as well as the UK, demanding a break not just with Rhodes, but also with the colonial legacies that he represented more broadly. The fierceness of these protests, as well as of the attempts to justify Rhodes that they provoked, demonstrates how much symbolic and political value we place in the past. So the past is a rich resource, both for those in power and for those seeking to challenge the dominant story. Art and culture have often been at the forefront of such debates about the past. The artwork for this event is an unsettling image by the Zimbabwean artist Owen Maseko. The painting, Babylon Songs, was part of an exhibition that he put on at the National Gallery of Bulawayo in 2010. The exhibition revolved around the Kukurahundi massacre of the early 1980s, the memory of which continues to be silenced by the ruling ZANU-PF party. True to form, the exhibition was shut down, the windows boarded up, and the artist arrested. Again, this illustrates well how threatening honest conversations about the past can be to the status quo. Now, as was the case with the hashtag Rhodes Must Fall movement, confrontations with the past often happen by people taking to the streets and to tweets. And these are important sites of public conversation. But another space of conversation, and one which perhaps allows for more nuance and afterthought, is literature. So what is the role of literature when it comes to dealing with the complex past in the Southern African region? How does literature function as a repository for shared memory, as a mediator and a social critique? These are some of the questions that will engage us for the next hour and a half. In the first hour or so, we will have a conversation during which Bettina and Elike will both read from their work. And at about 15:10, we will open up for questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please do post them in the live chat which should be to the right of the live stream. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to thank first the Nordic Research Councils for making this event possible through the NOS-HS grant. I'd like to thank the artist Owen Maseko for allowing us to use his artwork. And finally, I'd like to thank my colleagues on the organizing committee, Amanda Hammer from University of Copenhagen, Minani Amy from the Arctic University of Norway, Lena Englund from University of Eastern Finland, and Niklas Hållén from Karlstad University, as well as our fantastic student assistants, Alice Troy Donovan and Ololade Adiako Sundadjek, who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes to allow us to sit here today. Now, let me give a proper introduction to our speakers. Dr. Bettina Gappa is a Zimbabwean national who was born in Zambia and has law degrees from the universities of Cambridge, Graz, and Zimbabwe. She is currently the principal legal advisor of the Office of the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area based in Accra, Ghana. I've just heard that she's engaged in setting up an African version of the EU there. She's one of the pioneer lawyers of the Advisory Center on WTO law in Geneva for more than a decade, and she was the advisor to more than 70 African, Asian, Caribbean, and Latin American governments on all aspects of trade law and policy. Before that, she worked 3 years as a legal officer in the appellate body secretariat of the World Trade Organization. Now, as well as being a lawyer, Bettina is also an acclaimed novelist and playwright. She's the author of 2 novels, Out of Darkness, Shining Light from 2019 and The Book of Memory, and 2 short story collections, Rotten Row and An Elegy for Easterly. Her work has been published in more than a dozen languages, including by the New Yorker and Der Spiegel, and has been shortlisted for the Orwell Prize, the Sunday Times EFG Short Story Award, the Pan American Open Book Award, and the Prix Féminin Étranger, among others. She's the recipient of the Chautauqua Prize, the McKitterick Prize, the Guardian First Book Award, and Zimbabwe's NEMA Award. Bettina, thank you so much for being here today. Professor Elike Burma is Professor of World Literature in the English Faculty, Oxford, and Director of the Oxford Centre for Life Writing at Wilson College. She's a founding figure in the field of postcolonial and world literature studies in English. Her recent work includes postcolonial poetics and Indian arrivals, which won the 2015-16 Essay Prize. Her 2008 biography of Nelson Mandela has been widely translated, as has her republished colonial and post-colonial literature. Burma's fiction includes To the Volcano 2019 and Shouting in the Dark, which is the winner of the 2018 EASA Olive Schreiner Prize for Prose. To the Volcano was commended for the 2019 Australia Review of Books Elizabeth Jolly Prize, and last year Elike was awarded a British Academy of Senior Research Fellowship for Southern Imagining, a project which explores understandings of the world from the global south. Elike also works on the UCRI-founded Accelerate Hub, in which she researches how storytelling practices underpin and impact African identities. Elike, thank you very much for being here today. Now, to open up our conversation, I'd like to ask you both. South Africa and Zimbabwe, as I've already indicated, both have really painful pasts, as well as some intense contemporary debates about memory, whether of colonialism, the Gukurahundi massacre in Zimbabwe, apartheid in South Africa, the legacy of Cecil Rhodes, and so on. So what role do you see literature playing in this landscape? Here I'm thinking both now, in the past, and in the future. Bettina, perhaps if you would have a go at this first.
Thank you very much, Astrid, and I'm really sorry to make you read that long bio, but I think it's important to make it clear, because I have been introduced under the false assumption that I'm a human rights lawyer. You know, people see a Black woman who has written about her country, and the assumption is that I'm a human rights lawyer, but I'm actually a trade lawyer. But thank you so much for inviting us to this wonderful, wonderful event. You know, I've been thinking a lot about this question because I have decided that the past is where I'm going to reside, at least when it comes to my fiction and especially my long prose novels and so on. And I think that what fiction does is that it allows us, as you said so beautifully earlier, it allows us to have a more nuanced understanding than a hashtag ever can, because a hashtag is instant, it's a soundbite, it's, you know, activism. Fiction is not necessarily activism. Fiction allows us to take a pause and to look at perspectives that we might have missed in the moment, you know? And fiction also allows us to, fiction generates empathy, right? And it allows us to take a perspective that we might not normally take. For instance, I'm really opposed to the death penalty, viscerally opposed to the death penalty, have been since I was 17, and it's one of my campaign issues. I campaign against the death penalty. But one of my favorite stories is written from the perspective of a dropper, an executioner, the man who actually administers the death penalty, who kills other people in the name of the state. So by taking his perspective, and he's a white guy, so completely different from me, gender, sex, race, everything. By taking his perspective, I'm able to have, I think, a more nuanced view of an issue that I feel very passionately about. So I think that fiction can do that, especially if it's historical fiction, allowing us to look at the past through a slightly more nuanced perspective. It's not to say that it's necessarily a more forgiving perspective, but it's one that allows us to see the past as part of a bigger picture. Thank you so much. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Leke.
Thanks, Astrid, for your welcome and how great it is to be on this panel and in this conversation with Bettina. I agree strongly with a number of the things that Bettina said. The thing that I'd perhaps like to add, maybe just two things, is first of all, Bettina said the past is where I live. I would add, the past is something we cannot get away from. The past keeps impacting, intervening in, meddling with the present. And so fiction, short story, the novel, but also, of course, poetry in its different forms, but differently, allows us to locate ourselves as readers or as writers within those disruptive moments and to take a perspective on them. I mean, literature gives perspective. It gives the perspective, if you like, from on the ground, which is why it's the medium is often used by writers to tell the story differently from the vantage point of the marginal, the less considered, you know, the quote unquote voiceless. So literature allows the writer to, as it were, you know, recenter history, to as Bettina has done so beautifully in, you know, Out of Darkness, Shining Light, to give us the story of the, you know, the famous, the iconic carrying of Dr. Livingstone's body from Ujiji, you know, to Bagamoyo on the coast, but to tell that story from the vantage point of the bearers and the whole entourage. In a novel I published 2 decades ago now, a long time ago, I tried to tell the story of you know, some again iconic meetings and crossings between people like Churchill, Gandhi, Baden-Powell in the town of Ladysmith during the Boer War, but not to tell it from their point of view, you know, those named characters in history, but rather from those who kind of happened to be there. So I think perhaps one way of putting it in a nutshell is that fiction gives us a way of sorting out the disruption from the vantage point of, you know, a character or characters at the scene.
Thank you very much. And I think you brought in Bettina's book so well. So maybe Bettina, if you would like to introduce your book and do a reading from it.
See, Astrid, the problem with these conversations is that Eleke says something really interesting and I want to jump in on it immediately. I mean, I really want to read, I'm sorry to say I haven't read that book, but I really want to read your Ladysmith book, because the Boer War is a current obsession of mine. I mean, did you know that Kipling and Baden-Powell and I think Mary Kingsley were all in the Boer War in Ladysmith around about the same time. And the siege of Mafeking, the relief of Mafeking, is just one of the greatest military strategy stories there is. And I would love to write that story, but from the perspective of the poor horses, right?
Yes.
That had to be sacrificed and eaten, you know, because, you know, they ran out of food. But I really love, and I want to just emphasize that this is what my novel tries to do, which is to take what the Southeast Asian scholars call the subaltern view of history. And I'm a big military strategy buff, right? I love wars, not that they should happen, but I like, you know, thinking about Napoleon and Hannibal and people like that. And Chaka, you know, the horseshoe formation and those deadly assegais, right? But I like to think of those stories from the perspective of the foot soldiers, right? Not just the generals, right? So that's what interests me about the past. And that's why I deliberately chose to write about the companions, about Livingstone's companions, and especially the women, right? And not just the, you know, the Livingstone being the story that we know. And I deliberately started the book with a dead Livingstone. He's been speaking for about 200 years. I just wanted to silence him so that his companions could take center stage.
There's so much to say about this. I mean, history is, you know, I mean, it's that William Faulkner thing. The past is never just the past. It's over. It's present. It impinges on the now, and it's really important to take perspective on it, you know, whether it's the perspective of the horses or the military strategists or the soldiers, their assegais. And that is what fiction allows us to do, because the records, the historical records of those foot soldiers, and certainly the horses, just no longer exist. You know, they are fragments, they are shreds in the archive. And what fiction allows us to do, and you know, there's some brilliant fiction we could think about that does this, is to retell the story, but from that perspective.
And also, Astrid, if I may just jump in there, it allows us to tell the story, the same story, many times over. I remember a friend being absolutely horrified and saying to me, "Oh my gosh, Nangwali Sapel is going to write something about Chuma and Susi." And I was very excited because I wanted to know what Nangwali's take would be. You know, it's like the Tudors, you know, we know so much about the Tudors, but along comes Hilary Mantel and bang, it's all about Thomas Cromwell, right? And the next writer is going to come along and write about, you know, one of the other, you know, there were like 1,000 Thomases, right? One of the other Thomases, you know, the poor little boy who sang, for example. So it allows us, fiction allows us to revisit the same story over and over again, and each time with a fresher understanding, because it's always a different perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you. I was wondering if, for the benefit of the viewers, if you would read, I think you said you might want to read the opening of the book, just to give them a sense of the text.
Yes, I'm going to read from the prologue. So I'm just going to read maybe the first 2 pages. It's not going to be very long, but just to give people a sense of what the novel is about. And this is the chorus. So this is the voice of the entire party. So I'm going to start. And I start with a quotation from the last journals of David Livingstone. I trust in Providence still to help me. I know the four rivers, Zambezi, Kafue, Luapula, and Lomame. Their fountains must exist in one region. I pray the good Lord of all to favor me so as to allow me to discover the ancient fountains of Herodotus. And if there is anything in the underground excavations to confirm the old documents, the scriptures of truth, may he permit me to bring it to light and give me the wisdom to make a proper use of it. From the last journals of David Livingstone. This is how we carried out of Africa the poor broken body of Bwana Daudi, the doctor, David Livingstone, so that he could be borne across the sea and buried in his own land. For more than 1,500 miles, from the interior to the eastern coast, we marched with his body, from Chitambo to Mwanamuzungu, from Chisalamala to Kumbakumba, from Lambalamfipa to Tabora, until 280 days after we left Chitambo, we reached Bagamoyo, that place of sorrow, whose very name means to lay to rest the burden of your heart. We set him down in the hushed peace of the church, and all through that long night prayed and sang and keened the 700 manumitted slaves from the village of the free. After the tide came in the following day, they lined up on either side of the path that led to the dhow of his final crossing. And we watched until the white sail of that rickety wooden boat was a small dark triangle on the far horizon, and all that we could see of him was the sky meeting the shimmering sea. He gave up his life to the doomed, demented search for the last great secret of that heaven-descended spring, the world's longest river. He gave his all to uncover the secret that had preoccupied men of learning for more than 2,000 years, the source of the Nile. In the final 2 years of his life, both before and after he was relieved in Ujiji by the American Bwana Stanley, he was as a man possessed. In every town and village and hamlet through which we passed, Bwana Daudi asked the same question. Had any person seen or heard of a place where 4 fountains rose, 4 great fountains that rose out of the ground between 2 hills with conical tops? They were the fountains described in ancient times by a long dead sage called Herodotus, he said, from the far off land of Greece. To find these fountains, he believed, was to find the source of the Nile. When they asked to know what this Nile was, he said it was the world's longest river, but more than a river, it was a miracle of creation splendid beyond comprehension. For it flows for every day of the year, for more than 1,000 miles through the most arid of deserts, all without being replenished, for there are no tributaries that flow to fill it, he said. Bwana Daudi was certain that these fountains linked to 4 great rivers that he knew already, those of Kafue, Lomame, Luapula, and Zambezi. Herodotus, he said, had written that water from these fountains flowed in 2 directions, with half going up to Egypt and the other half flowing south. And thus it was that we followed the southward flow of the Luapula into the swamps of Bangweulu. But there, instead of finding the headwaters of the Nile, in the village of Chitambo, Bwana Daudi found his death. He is as divided in death as he was in life. His bones lie now in his own land, entombed in the magnificence of ancient stone. In the grave we dug for him under the shade of a mbula tree, his heart and all the essential parts of him are at one with the soil of his travels. The grave of his bones proclaims that he was brought over land and sea by our faithful hands. The wise men of his age say he blazed into the darkness of our natal land to leave behind him a track of light where the white men who followed him could go in perfect safety. This is all we 69 have ever been in his world. The 69 who carried his bones, the dark companions, his dark companions, the shadowy figures in the caravans in which he moved. We were only ever the pagazi on his journeys, the porters and bearers who carried his loads and built his huts and cooked his meals and washed his clothes and made his beds. The askari who fought his battles, his loyal and faithful retinue. On the long and perilous journey to bring him home, 10 of our party lost their lives. There are no stones to mark the places where they rest, no epitaphs to announce their deaths. And when we who remain follow where they led, no pilgrims will come to show their children where we lie. But out of that great and troubling darkness came shining light. Our sacrifice burnished the story of his life.
Wow. Thank you so much, Bettina. So you open this fabulous novel with this chorus, with the 69 bearers who are speaking collectively, but the rest of the novel is then the accounts of Halima, the cook, and Jacob Wainwright, a Nassika who's very much converted to Christianity and has this ambition to convert everybody around him, but who was taken from his childhood village and brought out as a slave and then rescued by the British and brought up in India into this very devoted Christianity. So I was wondering, how did you settle on these particular two protagonists out of the 69 possible bearers to tell?
That's such a great question, Astrid, because there are so many great characters in this. And in fact, I'm sort of half-heartedly adapting it for television right now, right? And it's sort of 8 episodes, and each episode looks at it from a different character's perspective. But initially, when I started, I had 15 voices. I was very much in the grip of Faulkner, As I Lay Dying, you know, that wonderful novel about the funeral march of that horrible matriarch, Abby was a face, right? So I was really in the grip of that novel, and I wanted the different characters to speak. But then I really couldn't work out which one was Chuma and which one was Susi. You know, the voices sounded kind of samey. Amoda and Chaupere sounded the same. Halima and Taweka sounded the same. So I ended up zooming in on those voices that I thought were particularly striking, at least to my ear. And those were Halima, Livingstone's very chatterbox, she's really a chatterbox of a woman. And this is actually based on Livingstone's own observations about, my goodness, she's got an outrageous tongue, and she would follow him down to the river where he wanted to bathe himself and should be chattering away. And Stanley also confirms independently that she was quite a talker. So I used that quality to expand the narrative of Halima as a super chatty, ferociously intelligent woman who happens to be illiterate because she's a slave. So she's completely intelligent in her own world, but she knows nothing about geography, nothing about why these people are here. And she just cannot understand why anyone would leave their home to look for the beginning of a river. I mean, are you crazy? You know? So it's that perspective of the people who might not have understood what Livingstone was up to, but who judged him on their terms, using, you know, the values of their world, right? And then Jacob Wainwright came to me as well as a very stiff, arrogant man who is quite insecure. I mean, we can talk about this a little bit more later, but Halima is a slave, but she's the most free person in the book. And Jacob Wainwright is a freed slave, but he's the most enslaved person in the book, because his enslavement is to ideals of a life that he can never, ever have, because he wants to have his own church, he wants to be a missionary and so on. So it was those two contrasting voices that I chose to focus on to tell the story. Thank you, Astrid.
Thanks. And if I can ask you just one more question before we hear Elike read from her work. I think there's an important theme actually in both of your works, but which is about the relationship between power and storytelling, who are left out of official history. And the opening collective voice here says that this story has been told many times before, but always as the story of the doctor. And Sarah Collins wrote a review of the book in The Guardian where she says that it, quote, offers a critical understanding of the usefulness of fiction for filling in history's gaps. So would you agree with that reading, also in connection to your other work? And do you see it as a, say, decolonial, anti-racist project to imagine those untold stories?
I certainly see myself as a writer who's committed to decolonization. Right from my first book, only it was very cunningly disguised. I wrote my first book, An Elegy for Italy, because I was tired of the reception of the Zimbabwe story as being the story of the white farmer. It's as simple as that. I was tired of the white memoir, the white farming memoir, as the story of the narrative of Zimbabwe. And, you know, my Alexandra Fuller is a dear friend of mine, and I really admire the work of Peter Godwin. But they, and their reception is not their fault. It's not the problem that they were seen as the voice of Zimbabwe, that kind of thing. You know, so I wrote in part to say, hang on, there's a bigger story here. Right? The big story is not just about the farms, but it's what's happening on the farms, the Black farm workers, the opposition, what's happening there, you know? And then I became the voice of Zimbabwe, which was thoroughly irritating because I was simply saying, there's another perspective. I wasn't saying this is the only perspective, you know? So I wrote to counter that reductionist narrative, right? And about my country. And then the more I started thinking about the kind of books I wanted to write, the more I realized that my larger project was really a decolonization project, to say that there was dignity in African history, there was dignity in African societies long before colonialism reached our borders. And so this Livingstone novel is kind of a way of not so much filling in the gaps of history, but shining the light on different aspects of history that are not talked about.
Thank you. Elike, would you like to respond to that and perhaps read some from your work as well?
Thanks, Bettina, for the reading. I mean, just before we move away from that, you know, very, very powerful and evocative reading, I thought there was also something interesting reflecting back to what we were saying at the beginning about history and literature. In that idea of Bettina's novel responding to Herodotus, you know, via David Livingstone's fantasy of finding the source of the Nile, because of course Herodotus is seen as the father of history, you know, but I think, is it Halima who says in the novel, you know, actually he's more the father of lies and delusions, because
it's Jacob Wainwright who points out that his description of the hippopotamus is nothing like any hippo that any African has ever seen.
It's, you know, again, it's that sort of alternative story, but then there's also something really, really, you know, amazing and very strong in that idea of bearing this burden, the burden of this dead white man, this myth, you know. I mean, for those of us, you know, committed to the decolonial project, and you know, I'm absolutely committed myself, you know, to tell the story of what it takes to carry that burden, the burden of that myth, the pain, the death, the suffering, is, yeah, it's a story that was needing to be told. So to try to step over to what you just asked me, Astrid, which is to read a little bit. As we are talking of Zimbabwe, I thought I would read from one of the longer short stories in this collection, To the Volcano, which has a Zimbabwean background, and it also, I think, it grapples with how we deal with, I mean, some might call it trauma or post-traumatic stress, But how we deal with the burden of war and war memory, which is very difficult to process, you know, how we in our lives, but also in fiction. The story is called Blue Eyes, and it is told in a series of short snapshots, and I'm going to read from 3. The main character is John, and he is a former Rhodesian soldier. He saw about a month of action in the Liberation War, and he was demobbed because, you know, independence was coming, liberation was coming. So you can imagine the story is set around the cusp of 1979 into 1980. And otherwise I'll simply plunge in. So from Blue Eyes. Do you eat anything besides eggs and chewing gum? John asks. No, Blue Eyes, John, Patty says, sliding down beside him. Did you know you have the bluest eyes I've ever seen? She pulls herself on top of him. Bluer than my dad's. It's the kind of blue that shows up blank in the old black and white colonial photos. You know, photos of lion hunts and all that. I don't want to think about my blue eyes. John kisses her. I don't either, says Patty. They were a weird blue. In the photos, the men's eyes look washed out with acid. Blue Eyes gave us away in the bush, in the war, when we had black camouflage on. I love it that you were in the war, Patty kisses him back. Later, he lies awake staring up at the ceiling. He sees the endless roads that they've just driven, zipping open the darkness, the thin ribbon of laterite and red earth running on and on to the horizon. Out on the passageway sofa, Mick snores in his familiar, halting way. Patty's damp hair on his cheek smells of egg. At last, around 6, John gives up the attempt to sleep. He slides quietly out of Patty's bed and takes a shower. Then he walks into campus to begin his university life. John, stop, stop, Patty calls the second night, shaking him. Stop shouting, you're making such a noise. Look, the bed is soaked. I'm going to have to change the sheets. Roll over now. Help me do this. And then I'm skipping to the final slice, the final snapshot, of the story. John is driving back to independent Zimbabwe to participate in the independence celebrations. John slides a Bob Marley cassette into the player. Brother, you're right. You're so right, Marley sings. Something about the voice decides him. The voice is all itself, like Orwell's voice. It has style, a measure. On this road running straight to the horizon, heading home, he wants to find a voice like that. Independence will bring a new measure, and he must find a way of tuning into it. Mick talked about artists returning to the country, frontline soldier poets from the camps in Mozambique, avant-garde troubadours who till last week camped out in English meadows begging beer money, all as mad and crazy as he, John, is, all biding their time of return. John thinks of plane loads of poets in the sky and is suddenly impatient to be home. He fast forwards the tape. No woman, no cry, one love. He can't find the song he wants. In fact, he doesn't know what the song is. He wants the 2,000 miles that lie ahead to be behind him. He wants the Limpopo at his back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elike. And I think this reading and also what you did not read speaks very much to the question of haunting. So John is very much one who's haunted by memories of this war. That's why he wakes up every night. So there are many, it seems to me, in your, not just this short story, but many of your short stories who are haunted. And you also mentioned when we talked about it the other day that you also have a haunted furniture in other novels and so on. What is it that interests you about haunting? Do you find haunting to be an apt metaphor for this unbidden presence of the past?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I think, you know, the present moment is replete with ghosts of the past, not least in the form of memory, in the form of, in particular, memories that we find difficult to deal with. I mean, I think one of the most unhelpful sort of partial metaphors, it's a sort of cliche now, really, that that people use is, you know, moving on. I've moved on. Yeah, how do we do that when our memories are loaded with the past, and especially when, as in John's case in that story, what he has done, and I decided actually not to kind of come to the scene where that becomes clear, for whatever reason. It is quite a difficult moment in the story, but you know, John has tried to move on. He's tried to, but what it was that he did is unresolved. He hasn't thought about it. He hasn't dealt with it. So he begins to hurt other people because those ghosts kind of impregnate his dreams. And yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the past resides in books, but it also resides in space, in as you were just saying, in pieces of furniture that you know, that have particular family memories or values or sentiment invested in them. And you know, the ghosts of the past or family members who have inhabited those chairs jump out from them, you know, and especially when that past is not fully resolved. And then the question is, how is the past resolved? Well, by telling stories, but sometimes, as with Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, those stories simply have to be told and retold. You know, how many novels do we not now have of, you know, the very traumatic Zimbabwean War of Liberation? How many novels do we not have? Well, I mean, of the First World War, you know. So these stories need to be, because otherwise the haunting kind of continues.
Yeah, Bettina, I was wondering if you could speak to the topic of haunting as well, because there's some even more explicit haunting going on in Out of Darkness, isn't there?
Yes, no, I really love this. I really love this strand of the conversation, because it's so much is not popping into my mind now. I mean, one of the motivations that the party has for getting Livingstone the hell out of Africa is that they believe that he will haunt them. If he doesn't, you know, it's like, get the white guy out. We don't want him buried here. But they have to be pragmatic, so they have to bury his intestines in, right? But Halima is worried about even that. She doesn't even want like his small intestine left in Africa, right? And by the way, that's one of the things that I had an enormous fun with, because of course, in the Victorian mythology, they buried his heart in Africa, you know, where he longed to be, that kind of thing. But really, it was a pragmatic thing that you can't exactly transport offal, right? Because essentially they biltonged him. Elika knows what biltong is. So they made him into Livingstone jerky. So for the longest time, I wrote this book over 20 years, and for a big part of it, I was calling it my Livingstone jerky novel, right? And when it came to disemboweling, preparing the body, I really unleashed my inner Stephen King, and I had lots of fun with, what they did to his body and so on. But one of the motivations was that they wanted him gone because they didn't want him to haunt. So there was that real haunting in that sense. But there's more allegorical haunting, what the past does if you don't deal with it. So I can say, for instance, that Zimbabwe is haunted by the ghost of Gukurahundi because we haven't dealt adequately. In fact, we haven't dealt at all with what many rightly call, I think you had Novio Rosa Chuma speaking in the seminar series, I think about a year ago, and she's written a lovely novel about that horrible past that Zimbabwe has yet to face, right? And for as long as we don't face that past, we're going to be haunted by it. So there's also haunting in that sense. But then there's also wider haunting in the sense of, in a way, every African city is haunted by colonialism. The haunting is in the names that we give to our buildings. It's in the names that we give to our streets. It's in the Cecil John Rose statues. It's in, so how do we deal with that haunting as well? How do we reckon with that past while still trying to take ownership of our present and stake a claim on our future, So I think haunting is a very apt metaphor for what happens when you don't deal adequately, especially with questions of justice that press upon you from the past. And the longer we wait to deal with, Gukurahundi, for example, the harder it will become, because as memories recede, the memory is then replaced by mythology, right? And it becomes, much, much harder to actually get at the truth, because then people no longer remember, and especially if people don't write things down, it becomes this big myth that can actually be even harder to deal with. I mean, think of the Armenian genocide, for instance, right? Or think of the Irish potato famine. If an injustice festers and festers and festers, it will never, ever leave. It will never disappear. So the brave thing, right, the just thing is to take on head on, especially while people are still alive, people who can testify to what happened to them. And the perpetrators can then either be called to account, or we can have a truth and reconciliation process, whatever we decide to choose. But I think Gukurahundi, for instance, I mean, one of my personal responsibility, my personal disappointment, and people know that I worked for Mnangagwa for 18 months on trade and investment, but my personal disappointment is that he promised so much in terms of how he was going to address some of these injustices, and nothing has been done because it's convenient not to. So I worry that the more we allow these hauntings to be part of our society, the harder it will be to actually deal with the past that we should deal with.
I think that's a beautiful observation, and it brings me to question about memory and unreliable memory, which seems to permeate both of your works. So for instance, your first novel was called Book of Memory, Bettina, and really thematizes unreliable memory, right? And Elike, you have all of these. You have several. Both you have John, who's not remembering except at night, but you also have many people in your short story collections who suffer from Alzheimer's, many more than I see in any other literary work. It was really interesting for someone who's had Alzheimer's close to me to actually read that perspective. And Bettina, you also have a short story where a protagonist refers to Zimbabwe as an amnesiac nation. So I was wondering how you see these individual flaws of memory comparing to those of nations.
Do you want me to jump in there?
Yeah, please.
I mean, there's so much to say, but in respect of what Bettina was just saying, I think one of the reasons why, I mean, this is on why we need kind of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in all post-colonies, including Britain, about empire, because otherwise these things don't go away and they become very polarizing. This is what we're seeing in Britain at the moment. To take only one example, all the debates about Churchill. Let's not even talk about Rhodes. All the debates about Churchill. Was he a mass murderer, or was he the hero of our darkest hour? And then all the opinions in between. The thing is, I think it's really unhelpful on the part of governments to shut these debates down, because otherwise, as Bettina was just saying, they become these myths, they become these nightmares, these terrible hauntings, and violence ensues, and people, there's severe division. So it's really important, I think, that these stories are told, and that they're told from their different perspectives. On your question, Astrid, it was about, remind me.
How these individual flaws of memory compare to those of nations,
yes,
or
how they Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is one of the reasons why we need to tell stories from our different perspectives, because memory is fallible. I mean, two people tell the story of the same incident that they've witnessed, and they'll tell it from their different perspectives. And a lot of our identity depends on how we tell our story, how we put together the memories that are important to us, how we present that story. And what is, of course, so disturbing and upsetting about Alzheimer's as a condition is that crucial scaffolding of memory to any person's identity disappears. So then the question of then what is left, and how do we cope? So I was really interested, almost as a sort of a thought experiment, but also because I am really preoccupied by what it is to lose memory for family reasons. I was interested in telling the story of different characters, both from within and from the outside, who are experiencing these sort of crises of memory and loss of memory, because it is interesting then to consider the question of how you tell that story. Does patterning dissolve? Well, yes, it does, I think. And so then how do you tell a story? How do you manage narrative? It's really an interesting problem as a narrator.
That's really interesting to me, Eleke, because I can draw a parallel between a patient with an older person with with Alzheimer's, and a nation that is consistently forgetting its past, right? Because there comes a point where if you write nothing down, you record nothing, there's a blankness there, right? There's a blankness on which you then build myths and legends, and then that becomes a problem. All nations need founding legends, but the founding legend, a founding legend based in genocide, or a founding legend based in a massacre, or the hurt of a significant number of people, that is not the kind of mythology or myth making that you want. I mean, you want the whole Paul Revere's horse kind of thing, you want the whole, I used to love when I was 10, the story about that little boy, I think his name was Hans, who put his finger in the dike in the Netherlands. You want that sort of like founding myths. You don't want ugly founding myths. But Astrid, I love that you mentioned the best title of any book that I will ever write, The Book of Memory, which unfortunately went to the worst book that I've ever written. And I have many ambivalent feelings about The Book of Memory. I think I've only read it twice since it was published, because it was a very painful and dark time for me writing that novel. So I don't really have a proper perspective over whether it's actually a good book. People tell me it is, but hey, people liked, people like strange things. People can have really bad taste. So I'm not going to go with what people say. But I like the idea of memory and its unreliability, whether it's unreliability coming from illness like Alzheimer's or amnesia, or unreliability coming from not having a full picture of something, just grasping something, just grasping one end of it, and then thinking you have the full picture, and then going off in confidence to say, this is the story. And that is the human experience, isn't it? I mean, we are all, in a sense, unreliable narrators. My goodness, especially on social media. You read one tweet and you think that's all this person has ever said about it, and then you go off on a rampage, and then it becomes a drama, So unreliability is a natural feature of the fallibility of human memory, I think, right? But where it gets problematic, as I said before, is then when it becomes a feature of a national memory. Now there we have a problem, because a nation is made up of many people, and many people contribute to that national memory by writing, by recording, by music, the arts, it's all part of building a national memory. So if you have a deliberate suppression of certain histories that people don't want remembered, then that unreliability of memory becomes a national problem, and a problem of history, and also a problem of justice.
I want to zoom in on one particular group that seems to interest both of you, and that you seem to give voice to. That's women. The role of women in your stories, it seems to me, is quite central. Elike, I think Blue Eyes is actually the only story in To the Volcano that is told from the perspective of a man, and yet it thematizes the male gaze on women, violence against women. Bettina, Out of Darkness, you give this fantastic voice to Halima, who, as you say, is a person whose voice would never be recorded because she was illiterate and a slave and so on. And yet here she does get a voice. So do you see literature as having a special role to play in this reclamation or expansion of historical voices, specifically when it comes to the gender aspect? I don't know whether any of you would like to go first on that.
I'm happy to go first because I'll be very quick. Absolutely, yes. For me, the subaltern is any person who has not been centered, right? So any person who's been marginalized. So it goes beyond race for me. It also goes to sex and sexual politics. So women are very, very important in my writing. I wrote a whole novel, again, the Book of Memory, centered in a women's prison. That's the most number of people I've ever included in a novel, 400 or so women. I'm now writing, because I'm terrified of alpha females, because I went to an all girls boarding school. So as soon as I see a gaggle of, brown girls coming towards me, especially if they're naked in their blush and block, so I have these nightmare visions about being at boarding school with 400 or so. 400 is an odd number for me, 400 girls. But I like telling the stories of women. I like telling the stories of hairdressers. I wrote a very funny short story set in a hairdressing salon about the gleeful retelling of the murder of a colleague of one of the hairdressers. If you don't think that murder is funny, you probably stay away from that story, because it's quite funny. But I do like telling the stories of people who don't normally appear in the history pages, right? So women are very important to me. Workers, Bertolt Brecht, A Worker Reads History is one of my favorite poems of all time. Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with names of kings. Was it the kings who hold the craggy rocks of rock, And when the Chinese wall was built, where did the workers go, So workers, women, Black people in white narratives, white people in Black narratives. I'm very interested in the story of the Rhodesian soldiers, for instance. How did the war look like from them? Because now, of course, it's the victors who've written the history of the war, right? There's a terrible, terrible episode in the Rhodesian war, in the War for Liberation, which is the downing of the Viscount over Victoria Falls or Kariba, I think it was, and it is a very ugly incident, and it would be, I would love to read that story told from all the perspectives of everyone who was involved in it, the white soldiers, the people on the ground, the Zipra guerrillas who brought it down, and so on. So for me, Astrid, in short, I'm interested in all subalterns, right? And a subaltern changes depending on the society we're talking about. So yes, I mean, women, you will read a lot about women in my writing, and also in writing that I'm still working on. Thank you.
And I can only echo that. I think, given continuing inequities and injustices and subalternity, to pick up on Bettina's term, given all of that, we cannot have enough stories of women, of workers, of people from the historical margins. So I had to grapple with my own sense of priorities in writing that story of John in Blue Eyes, because the perspective of Iris, who's a Black woman that he enters a relationship with for a time, the story of Iris was more compelling, but in the end, I needed to foreground the trauma, which is John's story. But for the rest, you're right. They're all stories of women. I mean, if we've mentioned social media off and on in this conversation, and it's still the case that women are and people of races other than white are universally given abuse on social media. So I see literature storytelling as a really important corrective to that. Not only, of course, but a really, really important corrective. We cannot have enough stories of women. I mean, some people may have seen there's a lot of talk at the moment about the biographer Philip Roth, and his extremely disturbing sexual politics, which, as it were, have amplified in the biography the very disturbing sexual politics that people in Roth's time, including Roth, were involved in. So, the corrective to that is for women's stories to be heard. So I'm really passionate about that.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could speak to the question of what pasts you find yourselves drawn to. So you've both written about the fairly recent past, as well as the early colonial or even pre-colonial past. So what is it that these different pasts allow you to explore? And Bettina, perhaps you want to start with how did you become interested in Livingstone's story and exploring that more distant past?
Yeah, so I've always loved history from the time I was a child, really. And in fact, when I was a child, when I was like 9, 10, and we moved, sort of 8, 9, we moved from a township to the suburbs. And I've just fell into this world of books, the Queen Victoria Memorial Library. Now, nobody had told me what history was at that point. So I'll be reading the story of, for instance, Queen Philippa of Calais, pardoning those, men who were supposed to be hanged and so on. And to me, it was just a gripping story. Or, what's his name, Custer and Little Big Horn, Sitting Bull, that whole battle with the Sioux and so on. And to me, it was just like, this is the most incredible story I've ever read, right? So there was a merging from a very early age of history and literature as one thing, just stories that I just couldn't get enough of. And then I started writing my own stories. And I actually, the first thing I ever wrote as a book was called Return to Planet Earth with an exclamation mark, because I was inspired by the idea of Australia as a penal colony. It just seemed like the most, just think about what that meant. You just take a whole continent, not even a country, but you take a whole continent and you say, this is the place that we're going to send our criminals to, because, you know, we don't want them fouling up our society. So we said, honestly, some of the things that have happened in history are just sick. So I was fascinated by this idea of a penal colony. So I imagined Mars as a penal colony that had, I should actually sell this to DreamWorks, that's, you know, the Earth is overrun and, you know, we establish a colony on Mars, and then the prisoners decide to build a robot to return to planet Earth, exclamation mark, right? So to me, history, stories, it all merged into one thing. So for me, it almost seems like a natural extension, using history as a vehicle to tell stories, because that's really what it is. But of course, there's a larger political project, which is the decolonization project. Right now, for instance, I am, I really shouldn't be announcing this, but I hope the audience is small and no one goes on Twitter, because it will be a great surprise to my agent to hear that I've abandoned the project I'm supposed to be working on. So right now I'm writing a children's series, right? A graphic novel series about 3 time-traveling African children. And they travel through African history, correcting injustices, you know. The first story is called Simba and the Elephants, and they go to Rome and the Alps to rescue Hannibal's elephants because they've stolen them from Great Zimbabwe. I'm playing with history here. So they go and they rescue the elephants. The second one is called Simba and the Golden Stool. They come here to Ghana and they help to fight the British, you know, in the War of the Golden Stool, you know, the famous War of the Golden Stool, led by a fierce Ashanti queen, Asagawa, you know, and then she ends up being exiled to Seychelles. Again, you dump people you don't want on another island. I mean, it's just astonishing. And then the third one is called, and Elika will love this, it's called Simba and the Asagais, because they travel to the Battle of Blood River and help, you know, Dingane fight the 4 trekkers and so on. So I want to give to children the same thrill that I had and that my son has when he reads his beloved Asterix, right? Because Asterix is just this really funny stories that are set in an alternative history in which the Gauls are resisting the Romans and so on. So I want to do that for African children and children around the world who might be interested in African history, to say, let's just trash it all, right? Let's just, like, you know, reinvent it. Let's just create an alternative African history in which there's time travel and people can travel between the Great Zimbabwe Kingdom and the Ashanti Kingdom and the Zulu Kingdom, and, you know, so that's what I'm working on. And for me, there is a very powerful relationship between history and literature, because to me, it's ultimately about stories and storytelling and fun.
And from different perspectives. In a novel I wrote, it's kind of almost a teen novel called Nile Baby. It's told from the perspective of these 2 children who discover a lot about Britain's buried African history. You know, the history of the Nubian soldiers on Hadrian's Wall.
Yes.
You know, an amazing history that has, you know, rightly now been, you know, pulled out of the realm of forgetting. But anyway, these 2 children's, you know, through the slightly ghoulish discovery, speaking of haunting, of a pickled fetus in their school lab, they go on this journey to bring this little embryo to rest, you know. So there's kind of aspects of horror, but there's also aspects of fantasy, and of using fantasy to retell history, to kind of reimagine that history but from the perspective of, you know, Roman Africans in Britain.
That's amazing. Does the features come to life at any point? Because that would be seriously creepy.
That would be telling, Bettina. That would be telling. There's a final moment that.
Okay, I will read the book. I will read the book. But it's a fantastic premise. I love it. I love it. And what it does, and is this colliding of two unlikely chapters in history, isn't it? And that's what makes it so fresh.
And you know, that amazing idea of these kind of really tall Nubian soldiers.
That's beautiful, beautiful, beautiful presentation. My question is about literature, history, and the humanities. How would the speakers respond to the problem of appreciating history and literature as a way of, oh, and something is missing here from the question. Could I get the rest of the question, please? Appreciating history
so far, especially the beautiful, beautiful, beautiful part.
Yes. The problem of appreciating history and literature as a way of, oh, that's the only text there is. I don't know if that's enough to go on.
Can the person who asked the question perhaps put it in?
Yeah, we're asking for a
clarification
to clarify. Meanwhile, I have some more questions for you, which is when you look back on the novels and short stories that you've both written, is there a change or a development you think in the way that you deal with your country's past and present?
It's a big question, Astrid. It's a very interesting question. I mean, there's a thing said about writers, which, by the way, I don't believe, but it is said that that writers just keep returning to and retelling the same story, you know, from a different angle or involving different characters, but essentially the same story, be it, you know, in a tragic mode or in a comic mode, or if I look back at the 5 novels I've written, they're very different generically. You know, I've tried out different things. I was very comfortable writing Bloodlines, which is the history of, you know, in part of the Boer War and the Irish soldiers in the Boer War. And I mean, I loved doing that. It involved quite a lot of research, and then it involved trying to, you know, to tell that very well-known history, but from the perspective of those whose presence wasn't even guessed at by, if you like, the main players. So I really enjoyed that. Nile Baby, the one I mentioned about the African Romans, or these, you know, that sort of revolves around the question of the African Romans. It was very, very difficult, really difficult, partly also because I was using a child's eye view, and I'm not a young adult writer, I don't think. So I was doing something very different with that, but I enjoyed it because it was challenging. And you know, I could go on picking examples. You know, I think another historical fiction awaits because I enjoyed that mode so much. But right now I'm writing a love story, which is another genre again, and very difficult. Surprisingly difficult.
LK, you and I should talk, because I'm also writing a love story. Yeah, it's a love story, but it's also a love story that's sort of set in the past. It's so I wrote a novel about, I think it was in 2006. I wrote a novel and I lost it because a Georgian gang broke into my apartment. I have, you know, I have the most gripping adventures. Even when I'm mugged or robbed, it's always something very thrilling, like being robbed by a Georgian gang. So they broke into my apartment, stole my laptop, and I hadn't backed up anything. So that novel went, and I just didn't have the heart to start writing it all over again, because it was like 64,000 words. And that's when you're really getting into your stride, you know? So, and it was a Zimbabwean take on Persuasion, my favorite Jane Austen novel. So I've found the courage to write it again, and I think it's probably better
Fantastic.
than so I'm writing that, and of course the time traveling little children, and so to get to your question, Astrid, how has my writing changed? I think because I know myself better. I now know what my mission is as a writer, and I'm not going to waver. I'm not going to, you know, get off that mission for any reason at all. But also because I went through, and this sounds like such a first world problem to have, I went through phenomenal success with my first book. And it was a short story collection, and nobody is that successful with a short story collection. And it turns out that, okay, maybe it was partly about my skill as a writer and what people liked the book, but it also turned out to be a stick with which to beat Robert Mugabe with. So I became a convenient, you know, club to beat my, you know, so I was seen as a political writer, purely political writer. And that really, really upset me, because that isn't why I wrote the book. That isn't primarily why I wrote the book. I wrote the book to show a different perspective on Zimbabwe, yes, but it was a perspective about resilience, about love, about joy, about humor. It's one of the funniest books I've ever written, right? But a lot of people just saw only the politics, which obviously it created problems for me at home, and it also just affected me as a writer. It really knocked my confidence, and it's one of the reasons it took me 6 years to produce my next book, because I just couldn't bear the idea of going on another panel and being asked, so what are you going to do about the troubles and Robert Mugabe? You know, what are you going to do about your country? I just couldn't bear to have those conversations. So I chose to stay away from all of that and just not write. But of course, the urge was still there. I was still writing. And then 6 years later, the Book of Memory came. So what that taught me is that I shouldn't worry about reception. I shouldn't worry about the audience. I shouldn't worry about what people say. I should just worry about, is this book the book that I want it to be? So now what I do is I generally don't announce things. The only time I'll announce things is when something is very close to being done. So I just drop a book, you know, like Beyonce style. She just dropped an album, and it's like, whoa, when did this happen? You know, so that's going to be my MO from now on. But the other change in me, Astrid and Eleke, I think we talked about this in our rehearsal, is that because I'm now a playwright as well, I find that anything about contemporary Zimbabwe that I want to write, I'm now doing it through my plays. I write plays about contemporary Zimbabwe, then we stage them in Zimbabwe, and then we have a wonderful discussion with the audience afterwards, and you know, it's lovely. The prose, I think, is going to be about the past, about, you know, my decolonization project. And I'm like Quentin Tarantino, you know, I know exactly how many books I want to write. I want to write 10 books, right? 10, no more, no less, and maybe, I don't know, 30 plays. But the minute I'm done with my 10 books, that's all I will have to say about prose and decolonization in history and the past. So they're all very nicely plotted, and I know exactly what's going to come first, and so on and so on. So I have to say that I now really know myself well. I know what my mission is, I know what's coming, and I know what genre I want to write certain things in. So contemporary stuff will be plays, historical stuff will be prose.
That sounds like you have a good plan there. So we now have the rest of the question. So how would the speakers respond to the problem of appreciating history and literature as a way of mental decolonization? There is a somewhat negative sentiment towards literature and history in general in so many parts of Africa. And the speaker says that this is either because governments do not want the people to learn, and then the rest of the question still seems to be missing. But this is the question about mental decolonization and the attitudes towards literature and history in Africa.
Look, I worry about a perspective that centers government in everything. Let's decenter governments. So what if they don't want people to learn about Gukurahundi or whatever? Just write anyway. So what if they don't want people to think about corruption? Just expose it anyway. I would say that worrying about what the government take on anything is sure to, that's where madness lies, really. And it's not even just Africa. If we were to take the British government and their weaponization of the flag, and their weaponization of the Churchill legacy. I mean, Boris Johnson actually thinks he's Winston Churchill. I mean, first of all, brush your hair, and then maybe we'll take you seriously, right? But honestly, I mean, just this idea of using the past for nationalistic purposes. I mean, most nations have gone through this, right? So let's not take government seriously when they tell us how to read history, because they're not honest brokers in this at all. They're not honest brokers. So I would say that artists should feel independent, and Owen Maseko, you opened up with a beautiful painting by Owen Maseko. Owen Maseko should not wait for the government to accept that Gukurahundi was a crime against the people of Matabeleland and Midlands. He shouldn't wait for that acceptance, because if he does, it's never going to come. So he should continue his work. People should continue writing, people should continue exposing, people should continue debating. We shouldn't wait for government to change their minds on certain things, especially when it comes to how we remember the past, because where they are implicated, they can never be honest brokers. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. There's a way in which all writing, literary writing, is political, but literature should not be used as an instrument of politics. I mean, in any work that kind of speaks from a particular position of authority and that is used to endorse it or to underwrite its agenda is going to be a compromised work of literature. It absolutely goes against what we were saying right at the beginning about, teasing out multiple perspectives and telling it from below or telling it otherwise or telling it differently. That's where the politics of literature comes in, but not with as it were, telling a novel that would tell the heroic story of Churchill in this moment would be a tainted novel, so yeah, I mean, there are books that, I mean, and this is why it's always fascinating what kinds of novels are set for matriculation exams or A-level exams, because often the exam boards pick the novels that appear to tell the story of the nation. It's interesting that, for example, Ian McEwan's Atonement has been an A-level set text in the UK for a number of years. That's a very interesting, linking up of modern Britain with that story. And of course, it's absolutely crucial that the First World War is the underlying historical thread to that novel. It in no way compromises the novel, which I deeply admire, but it nonetheless, what we readers and teachers and writers, bring to what we want from any novel is partly the story of our community. We want to hear that story told, but where a government becomes invested in a certain story, or an authority does, that story then appears different. It appears authoritative, and part of what literature does is precisely to disrupt authority.
Eleke, speaking of Atonement, it's one of my absolute favorite novels. And that film, that especially that Dunkirk scene where, there's a single shot panning onto the beach and the horses being shot. I have a thing about horses, the horses being shot and so on. I mean, it's just absolutely beautiful. But it actually gets me to think about the First World War in the British imagination, Vietnam in the American imagination. Now, if you don't know history, and this is the danger of fiction and films, right? If you don't know history, you will think that the Americans won the Vietnam War, right?
Yeah.
Because it's such a coming of age story for America as a nation. Of course, what you don't realize is that America has basically been at war every single decade. So that's why the pullout from Afghanistan is so important, because this may be the only decade in which America is not going to be at war, right? But so Vietnam was just a continuum of that very militaristic foreign policy. But it's presented as the loss of American innocence. It's these poor boys dying for nothing, because really they died for nothing. And it's the same story with the First World War. And I think that's what makes these stories so poignant, because you actually ask yourself, what really was the First World War about? What were the strategic interests that were being defended? And then, of course, it's so beautifully told in the soldier poets, Wilfred Owen, Sigrid Sassoon, and so on. And so there's this moment of innocence and ugliness that is just so powerful and so poignant, And there are very few nations that have zoomed in on a central national point that unites everybody. I mean, everybody in the UK would be united around the First World War, or even the Second World War, for instance. Americans, of course, there was opposition to the Vietnam War, but there's kind of a nostalgia. There's a nostalgic eye with which you watch Apocalypse Now and so on. I don't know that South Africa has anything like that. Maybe the freeing of Nelson Mandela. Maybe that's sort of like the moment that everyone can sort of like coalesce around. For us, we thought it would be the toppling of Robert Mugabe. Well, look at how that adventure turned out. I mean, so it can be dangerous to point to just one moment as the moment for a nation, But I was just sorry, to take us a little bit away from the conversation. I was just really struck, Eleke, with what you said about atonement, because it's such an incredibly powerful novel that really speaks to an incredible moment in the life of a nation. Everything sort of coming together.
And there's a lot to say about literature as a form of atonement for history too. I mean, the novel is narrated by from the perspective of a young girl who will be a writer, and it asks those questions about what is true, and from whose perspective that we've been talking about here.
The unreliability of memory, and that whole idea of justice. Something very unjust happened, and it's tainted this girl's life and the lives of the people around her. And can you ever make that right, even in just writing about it?
Yes. Well, that's a big question. Can you make it right in writing about it?
Thank you so much, both of you. There is a question from the audience that about Book of Memory, which you might want to quickly address before we wrap up.
Okay.
So the question is, how effective is the image of Ngozi in demystifying that albinism is not a curse?
Wow, thank you for raising the Ngozi. Ngozi is basically an avenging spirit, and it's how the Shona communities, Shona speaking groups, dealt with crime and murder, especially before we had jails, right? So the idea was to prevent crime, not to punish it. So if you killed somebody, you did so knowing that you were going to curse yourself, your children, and their children down to the end of the line, unless some kind of compensation, recompense was made, right? It's a form of restorative justice, right? And the idea is that the Ngozi is the spirit of the dead, right? Of the dead who have been slain unjustly. That spirit will haunt you, haunting again. That spirit will haunt you until justice, until justice is delivered. And the Shona expression is Mosha Ayori, right? A crime does not rot. right? In other words, there's no statute of limitations on certain crimes, right? So it's actually a very powerful judicial principle that you find in almost every judicial system. So in the Book of Memory, the woman at the center of the novel is an albino woman whose mother believes that her albinism is a manifestation of Ngozi's spirit because of a murder that happened in the family a long, long time ago. So it's not really so much about linking Ngozi to albinism, but it was more about the idea that justice will out, right, in whatever form it takes. And in an unsophisticated family like this poor memories family, they see her albinism as a manifestation of a curse. But of course it isn't. It's a genetic disorder. There's a spontaneous mutation in the genes, and she's born, with albinism. So they see it as that, but of course it's not that at all. But for me, Ngozi was more about how the same notions of justice play out across different societies, right? The idea that every crime has to have recompense, every crime has to find a just outcome. And so I was playing around with that idea of Ngozi to achieve that purpose, not so much to say that there's a link between the Ngozi and somebody having albinism. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I think with this, you tied very well together your other career as a lawyer, speaking of justice, to this question of the politics of the past as they play out in your novels. Thank you so much, both of you. I'm afraid we have to end this conversation here, even though I have this feeling that it could go on and on. It's been really stimulating. I hope that you in the audience have also feel that you can go enriched onto the weekend. Thank you, Elike. Thank you, Bettina. And thank you very much for the audience for coming today.